Hello guys. In this video, you will hear 5 horror stories. Anyone under the age of 18, please do not watch this video. Story 1. The Grave Beneath the Falls. Location: Devil's Kettle Falls, Minnesota, USA. Part 1. The Descent. Harold Groves had always been fascinated by mysteries of the natural world. As a seasoned hydrologist, he had dedicated his career to studying rivers, waterfalls, and the hidden mechanisms of Earth's water systems. Yet none had captivated him quite like Devil's Kettle Falls ***, an anomaly tucked away in the dense woods of Minnesota. Here, half the water of the Brule River cascaded over the falls, disappearing into a hole in the rock where it was never seen again. No exit had ever been found, despite years of research and testing. Harold had been sent by the state to conduct yet another study, this time equipped with new technology that might reveal where the water went. The townsfolk, however, had their own theories. They spoke in hushed tones about the falls being cursed, a portal to the underworld where the spirits of the dead were dragged down into the abyss. Harold had dismissed such talk as folklore, local legends meant to scare the tourists. After all, every place had its ghost stories. His first day at Devil's Kettle had been uneventful. He had set up his instruments, measuring the flow of the river and taking water samples for further analysis. The weather was cool, with a light mist hovering over the falls, giving the entire area a mystical quality. The sound of the water crashing over the rocks was constant and almost soothing, though the abyss at the base of the falls gave Harold an unsettling feeling. On the second day, however, things took a strange turn. Harold had ventured closer to the mouth of the abyss. His curiosity piqued. His plan was to lower a camera into the hole using a long, reinforced cable, hoping to get a view of whatever lay beneath. As he approached, he noticed something unusual, an opening behind the curtain of water. The rocks were slick with moisture, and the entrance was barely visible unless you knew where to look. Without hesitation, Harold crawled through the narrow gap, stepping into a small cavern. The sound of the falls was deafening here, the water crashing just feet away from him. But inside the cave, there was an odd stillness, as though the world had stopped just beyond the entrance. The cave was dark, but Harold's flashlight revealed a sloping tunnel that descended deeper underground. His heart raced with excitement. Could this be the key to the mystery of Devil's Kettle? Had previous researchers simply missed this passage? Harold decided to explore. He radioed back to his team at the campsite, informing them of his discovery. But the static on the other end made it clear they hadn't received his message. Undeterred, Harold continued, his flashlight casting long shadows on the wet stone walls. The tunnel twisted and turned, leading him deeper into the earth. The air grew colder with each step, and the sound of the falls faded until all Harold could hear was his own breathing. The tunnel eventually opened into a larger chamber, and Harold's flashlight revealed something that made him freeze in his tracks. The ground was littered with bones, skulls, rib cages, femurs. They were scattered across the floor of the cave, some half buried in the dirt. The walls of the chamber were lined with skeletal remains, stacked haphazardly as if they had been thrown there by some unseen force. Harold's stomach churned. These weren't just animal bones, they were human. He knelt to examine one of the skulls, his hands shaking slightly. The bone was old, worn smooth by time, but the teeth were intact, giving the skull a ghastly grin. Harold swallowed hard, trying to suppress the rising panic. How had no one found this before? Why hadn't there been any reports of human remains near Devil's Kettle? As he stood up, the sound of running water returned, but it wasn't coming from the falls. It was a low, steady rush, like a river flowing just beneath the surface of the cave. Harold turned, shining his flashlight toward the back of the chamber, and that's when he saw it. A figure, rising from the shadows. It was enormous, towering over the piles of bones, its body made entirely of water and bone. Skeletal arms extended from a churning mass of liquid, and its face, if it could be called a face, was a skull, stretched and twisted over a current of water that never ceased. The creature's eyes were hollow, dark pits that seemed to absorb the light from Harold's flashlight. Harold stumbled back, his heart racing. He had no words for what he was seeing. It was as if the very water from the falls had taken on a monstrous, malevolent form, a thing that shouldn't exist in the natural world. The creature moved toward him, its body sloshing and shifting with every step. Its skeletal hands reached out, and Harold could see that they weren't just bones. They were fragments of the remains littering the cave floor, fused with the water to create this nightmarish being. It was the Plunge, the spirit of Devil's Kettle Falls, a creature made of all the souls and bodies it had claimed over the centuries. Harold's breath caught in his throat as he realized what the locals had meant. The falls didn't just take water, they took lives, and now it wanted his. Part 2. Into the Abyss. As he ran, Harold's mind raced. What was this thing? How had it come to exist? The legends about Devil's Kettle Falls suddenly seemed far more than local superstition. But there was no time to think. The plunge was real, and it was after him. The narrow tunnel twisted again, and Harold's hope flickered as he spotted a faint light at the far end. Could it be an exit? With a burst of speed, he sprinted toward the light, his breath ragged and his heart pounding in his chest. Behind him, the monstrous creature sloshed and scraped through the tunnel, its presence growing colder and more oppressive. Just as Harold reached the end of the tunnel, he emerged into a small cavern that opened to the outside. The roar of the falls filled the air, the sound almost deafening, and sunlight filtered down through a jagged crack in the rocks above. He could see the rushing water of the Brûlé River not far away, and for a brief moment, relief surged through him. But then he felt it, the unmistakable pull of the plunge behind him. The creature wasn't done with him. He could feel the air chill even more, and the water in the cavern seemed to rise and churn unnaturally, as if the very earth beneath his feet was being consumed by the abyss. Harold turned and saw the plunge crawling toward him, its skeletal form now fully merged with the water. Bones and water swirled together in a grotesque dance of life and death, and the creature's empty eyes locked onto him with a malevolent hunger. Harold's mind raced. There was no way to outrun it, and no way to fight it. He had to think of something, or he would be the next soul claimed by the abyss. And then it hit him. The creature was made of water, water that was connected to the falls. If he could disrupt the flow of the water, maybe he could weaken the creature. But how? There was no dam, no structure to break. The falls were a natural phenomenon, an unstoppable force of nature. Except, the water disappeared. Devil's Kettle wasn't normal. It had no known exit, no endpoint. The water, like the plunge itself, seemed to vanish into nothing. And that meant there was a flaw, a weak spot. If he could somehow direct the water back into the abyss, back into its source, maybe it would pull the creature with it. But the cavern was small, and there was no visible way to divert the flow. Harold glanced around frantically, his mind grasping for a solution. Then he saw something. A series of smaller, narrow channels carved into the rock, leading down toward the edge of the abyss. These channels were too small for a person to follow, but they carried water down into the dark, where the river seemed to vanish. Harold had an idea, but it was a gamble, one that could easily cost him his life. He sprinted toward one of the channels, splashing through the shallow water that flowed through it. The plunge let out a low, guttural growl as it advanced, its bones scraping against the rock. Harold could feel the pull of the creature, the sheer cold emanating from it sapping his strength. His heart pounded in his chest, and his body felt like it was being dragged toward the abyss even before the creature touched him. Reaching the edge of the channel, Harold grabbed hold of a loose boulder that had wedged itself between the rocks. The boulder was heavy, slick with moss and moisture, but he heaved with all his strength, straining against its weight. The creature closed in, its skeletal arms reaching out, bony fingers dripping water that steamed in the air. With one last desperate shove, the boulder gave way. It tumbled into the channel with a crash, redirecting the flow of water with it. The current shifted, and Harold felt the pull of the water intensify as the small stream was sucked downward, plunging into the darkness below. The effect on the plunge was immediate. The creature let out a horrific, gurgling scream as the water surrounding it swirled and shifted, pulled by the new current. Its skeletal arms flailed as the force of the water dragged it toward the abyss, and Harold could see the bones within its body breaking apart, sucked into the whirlpool below. For a moment, it seemed as though the plunge was fighting the pull, its watery form clinging to the rocks, trying to resist. But the force of the current was too strong. With a final guttural wail, the creature was sucked downward, disappearing into the black depths of the earth. The water roared and crashed as it was swallowed by the abyss, and then, just as suddenly, the cavern grew still. The air warmed, and the oppressive presence of the plunge was gone. Harold stood at the edge of the channel, his heart still racing, his body trembling with exhaustion. He had done it. But as the roar of the falls echoed through the cavern, Harold realized that his ordeal wasn't over. The water was still disappearing into the abyss, still flowing into a place that no one had ever seen. And something about that endless void filled him with a sense of dread. He had survived, but the falls would continue to claim lives. The abyss was still hungry, still waiting. Part 3. What lies beneath? Harold collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath. His muscles burned, and his body felt as though it had been drained of every ounce of strength. For several minutes he remained there, kneeling at the edge of the abyss, staring into the swirling water as it was swallowed by the earth. The cavern was silent now, save for the distant roar of Devil's Kettle Falls above him. The plunge was gone, but the eerie quiet only served to heighten the sense of dread that gnawed at Harold. The falls were still there, still pulling water, and perhaps more, into the unknown. As his breath slowed, Harold realized that he couldn't stay here. He needed to get back to the surface, back to his team. They had no idea what was happening beneath the falls, no idea what he had encountered. They were waiting for him to return, assuming this was just another routine investigation. If they didn't hear from him soon, they might send someone else down. And that couldn't happen. The cave had to remain a secret. Whatever was down here, whatever forces were at play, it was too dangerous. No one could know. Harold forced himself to his feet, his legs trembling as he made his way back to the narrow tunnel. His flashlight was still intact, though the beam had grown weaker. He clicked it off, conserving the battery, as he moved by memory through the darkened passage. It was a slow, difficult climb back toward the surface. The walls of the tunnel were slick with moisture, and Harold's boots slipped more than once on the uneven stone. Every step felt heavier than the last, and his mind was still reeling from the events he had just witnessed. As he neared the entrance of the cave, the faint glow of daylight filtered through the narrow crack in the rocks. The sound of the falls was louder now, a constant roar that filled his ears as he crawled out of the tunnel and back onto the ledge behind the waterfall. For a moment, Harold simply stood there, staring at the cascade of water as it poured into the abyss. It was hard to believe that something so beautiful, so seemingly peaceful, could hide such a dark and terrible secret. The mist from the falls dampened his skin, but it did nothing to cool the fire that burned within him. He had seen what lay beneath the falls, and he knew that it wasn't just water that Devil's Kettle was taking. It was lives, souls, dragged down into the depths where they were consumed by whatever force lay at the heart of the abyss. Harold turned away from the falls, making his way back toward the trail that led to the campsite. His thoughts were a jumbled mess, and he struggled to make sense of what had happened. How could he explain this to his team? Would they even believe him? But as he approached the campsite, something caught his attention. The tents were still there, but the air felt wrong. Too quiet, too still. There was no sign of movement, no sound of voices or equipment. His heart sank. Harold quickened his pace, his breath coming in short bursts as he neared the camp. When he reached the clearing, he froze. The camp was empty. The tents were torn, their fabric flapping in the breeze. Equipment was scattered across the ground, abandoned as though the team had fled in a hurry. But there was no sign of a struggle. No bodies, no blood, nothing to indicate what had happened. Harold's heart raced as he scanned the area. He called out their names, his voice hoarse and desperate, but there was no response. His radio crackled with static, useless now that he was out of the cave. And then, he saw it. Near the edge of the clearing, just beyond the campsite, was a small pool of water. It was shallow, barely more than a few inches deep, but the surface was unnaturally still. As Harold approached, he saw something that made his blood run cold. In the center of the pool, barely visible beneath the water, was a human skull. It was old, its bone yellowed with age, but there was no mistaking it. And scattered around the skull were more bones, ribs, femurs, vertebrae, all half submerged in the water. Harold stepped back, his mind reeling. The falls had taken them. His team, the people he had worked with, had been claimed by the same force that had tried to claim him. And now, their remains were scattered across the clearing, their bodies absorbed by the earth, just like the water that disappeared into the abyss. A cold realization settled over him. The plunge wasn't the only danger lurking beneath Devil's Kettle. The entire area was cursed, infected by the same malevolent force that had created the creature. And now, it was spreading. The falls didn't just take water, it took everything. Part 4. The Falls Demand. Harold's hands shook as he backed away from the pool, his mind struggling to process what he had just seen. His team was gone, claimed by the same force that had almost claimed him. The bones scattered in the water were all that remained, a grim reminder of the power that lurked beneath the falls. He felt sick. The ground beneath his feet felt unstable, as if the entire forest was shifting and warping around him. His senses screamed for him to leave, to run as fast as he could, but his legs refused to move. The stillness of the air was suffocating. Even the sounds of nature seemed to have fled from this cursed place. Harold felt as though he had stepped into a world that was no longer his own, a world governed by the abyss that lay beneath the falls. Finally, his survival instincts kicked in. He had to leave. Now. Turning on his heel, Harold sprinted toward the path that led back to the main road. His legs were heavy, his breath ragged, but fear drove him forward. Every step felt like it brought him closer to safety, further from the malevolent pull of the falls. But then the ground began to tremble. Harold stumbled, catching himself on a nearby tree as the earth beneath him shook violently. The roar of the falls grew louder, as if the water itself was rising to meet him. The tremors intensified, and Harold's heart sank as he realized what was happening. The abyss was opening. Behind him, the ground near the falls began to split, jagged cracks spreading through the earth like fingers reaching for him. Water gushed from the fractures, pooling in the cracks as the earth seemed to be consumed by the very same force that had claimed the water. The abyss wasn't content with the falls alone. It wanted more. It wanted Harold. Panic surged through him as he scrambled to his feet, running blindly through the woods. The trees swayed and groaned, their roots threatened by the shifting earth. The path ahead of him seemed to twist and turn, as though the forest itself was conspiring to keep him trapped. Harold pushed forward, ignoring the burning in his lungs and the ache in his muscles. He could hear the falls behind him, but they no longer sounded like water crashing against rocks. The roar had become something else, something alive, something hungry. And then from the depths of the forest, he heard a voice. It was soft at first, barely more than a whisper, but it grew louder with every step he took. The voice was deep, ancient, and filled with a terrible knowing. "Harold!" He skidded to a stop, his heart thundering in his chest. His eyes darted around the trees, but there was no one there. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing through the forest like the wind. "Harold, you cannot escape!" He shook his head, fear gripping him tightly. He didn't know what this was, some trick of the mind, or perhaps the malevolent force speaking to him directly. But he knew he couldn't stop. He had to keep moving. But as he took another step, the ground gave way beneath him. With a scream, Harold fell into the earth, the forest swallowing him whole. He tumbled through darkness, his body slamming against rocks and roots as he was pulled deeper into the abyss. The air grew colder, the pressure around him building as if the earth itself was crushing him. And then, with a splash, he hit water. The cold was like a shock to his system, stealing his breath away as he sank into the frigid depths. His limbs flailed, his instincts screaming at him to swim, but the current was too strong. It pulled him down, deeper and deeper into the darkness. Harold's mind raced. He couldn't die here, not like this. He had to find a way out, had to survive. But the water was relentless, pulling him further into the abyss, where no light or air could reach. Just as he thought he would lose consciousness, he felt something beneath him. Solid ground. He kicked frantically, pushing himself upward until his head broke the surface of the water. He gasped for air, his chest burning as he dragged himself onto the rocky shore. Coughing and sputtering, Harold lay on the cold, wet stone, his body trembling with exhaustion. The darkness around him was absolute, and the roar of the falls was now a distant, muffled sound. But he wasn't alone. Slowly, Harold lifted his head, his eyes adjusting to the faint glow that seemed to emanate from the walls of the cavern. The light was dim, barely more than a soft shimmer, but it was enough to reveal the figure standing at the edge of the water. It was the plunge. The creature stood tall, its skeletal form towering over Harold, its bony arms outstretched, as if welcoming him into the depths. The water that made up its body churned and shifted, and Harold could see the faces of the dead. His team, the countless souls claimed by the falls, trapped within the creature's form. The plunge stepped forward, the bones beneath its watery surface rattling with every movement. Its hollow eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, and Harold felt the pull of the abyss once again. "Harold," the voice whispered, "you belong to us now." Terror gripped him, but there was no escape. The creature was too close, its presence overwhelming. The abyss had claimed him, just as it had claimed all the others before him. With a final, desperate scream, Harold lunged forward, his hands closing around the creature's bony form. He had no plan, no strategy, only a primal need to fight, to survive. The water of the plunge surged around him, pulling him into its depths, but Harold didn't let go. He clung to the creature, determined to take it down with him. And then, as the water rose over his head, he felt it, the pull of the abyss. The same force that had taken the water, the bones, the souls. It was dragging him down, pulling him into the darkness, where no light could ever reach. But as Harold's vision faded, as the last remnants of his strength left him, he realized something. The abyss didn't just take. It demanded asterisk. It demanded lives, souls, sacrifice, and Harold had given it exactly what it wanted. With his final breath, Harold smiled. The abyss would never be satisfied, never be full, but it had taken him, and that was enough. The end. Story 2. The War Bunker's Curse. Location: Maginot Line, Alsace, France. Part 1. The Discovery. Louise Fournier adjusted her glasses as she studied the faded map spread across the stone table. The air in the small archive room of the Alsace Historical Society was musty, and the dim light filtering through the narrow windows did little to brighten the space. Dust motes hung suspended in the air as if time had frozen in this forgotten corner of France. For months, Louise had been researching the abandoned bunkers of the Maginot Line ***, the infamous defensive fortifications built along France's borders in the years leading up to World War II. Many of the bunkers had fallen into disrepair or were sealed off, the military history they once housed now buried beneath layers of soil, stone, and neglect. But one particular bunker had caught her attention, a structure that had been sealed and forgotten after the war, its entrance lost to history. The mystery surrounding the bunker was what had drawn her in. Official reports were sparse, but local legends claimed that a unit of soldiers stationed inside during the war had vanished without a trace. There had been no bodies, no signs of struggle, just silence. Theories ranged from desertion to secret military experiments, but none explained why the bunker had been permanently sealed off after the war ended. Louise's finger traced the faded lines of the map, leading to a small, inconspicuous mark deep within the forests of Alsace. This was it, the location of the lost bunker, now buried beneath decades of growth. She had pieced together the map from various sources, consulting old military records, diaries, and local stories. And now, she was ready to find it. Packing her field bag with a notebook, camera, flashlight, and a few basic supplies, Louise set out for the forest. The autumn sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the dense trees. The air was crisp, and the leaves crunched beneath her boots as she hiked deeper into the woods, guided by the landmarks she had memorized from the map. After hours of walking, Louise spotted it, a small mound of earth, covered in thick moss and vines, with what appeared to be the outline of a metal door partially visible beneath the growth. Her heart quickened as she knelt to inspect it. The door was rusted and warped, its once solid frame now barely recognizable under the weight of time. But it was unmistakable. This was the entrance to the bunker. With a deep breath, Louise pulled out her flashlight and tools, setting to work clearing away the debris that had accumulated around the door. It took nearly an hour, but finally, the rusted hinges gave way with a groan, and the door creaked open, revealing a dark, gaping maw that led into the earth. She hesitated for a moment, the cool air from within the bunker brushing against her skin like the breath of something ancient. There was an eerie stillness, the kind that settles in places untouched by human hands for decades, but curiosity drove her forward. This was the discovery of a lifetime, and she couldn't turn back now. Taking a step inside, Louise clicked on her flashlight and aimed the beam into the darkness. The tunnel before her was narrow, the stone walls cold and damp to the touch. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of her own breathing and the occasional drip of water echoing from deeper within. As she ventured further into the bunker, she began to notice remnants of the soldiers who had once called this place home. A half-empty ration tin lay discarded on the floor, its contents long rotted away. A jacket hung on a rusted hook, the fabric brittle and decayed. A deck of cards sat on a table, as if the players had simply stood up and left, never to return. Louise shivered, though the air was not particularly cold. There was something deeply unsettling about the place, as though it were frozen in time, yet also waiting for something, or someone. Her footsteps echoed through the narrow corridors as she explored deeper, her mind racing with questions. Where had the soldiers gone? Why had they abandoned everything? And why had no one ever come back? She turned a corner and stopped dead in her tracks. The corridor ahead was blocked, but not by debris or collapse. Instead, a thick layer of swampy vegetation clung to the walls and floor, tendrils of moss and mud creeping up from the ground like a living carpet. The air was damp and heavy, and the smell of decay was overpowering. Louise's heart raced as she stepped closer, her flashlight illuminating the grotesque sight before her. The vegetation wasn't just moss or swamp muck. It was fused with bones, human bones. Louise gasped, covering her mouth as her flashlight passed over the remains of what must have been the soldiers. Their skeletal forms were intertwined with the plants, their bones half submerged in the mud, their hollow eye sockets staring up at her from the darkness. Some were still wearing the remnants of their uniforms, their weapons rusted and useless by their sides. Panic surged through her, and she stumbled backward, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. She had to leave. Now. Whatever had happened here, whatever had claimed the lives of these men, was not something she wanted to face. But as she turned to flee, something moved in the shadows. A faint rustling sound echoed through the tunnel, like the shifting of wet leaves or the scraping of bone against stone. Louise froze, her heart pounding in her ears as she aimed her flashlight toward the sound. At first she saw nothing, just the dark, twisted forms of the vines and vegetation that lined the walls. But then, slowly, something began to emerge from the muck. A figure. It rose from the swampy ground, its body an unholy fusion of decayed human corpses, mud, and swamp vegetation. Its limbs were long and twisted, its skin a patchwork of rotting flesh and moss. The creature's face was the most horrifying, stretched tight over a skeletal frame, with gaping holes where eyes should have been, and a mouth that never fully closed, dripping with stagnant water. Louise's blood turned to ice. It was *** Le Marquage, the ancient creature the locals had whispered about. The swamp dweller that fed on fear, human flesh, and the life it could steal from those foolish enough to disturb its lair. And now, it was coming for her. Part 2. The Depths of Fear. Louise's flashlight trembled in her hand as she took an unsteady step backward, her eyes locked on the abomination rising before her. The creature's form was grotesque, barely human, yet unmistakably alive with a malevolent intent. The swamp seemed to pulse around it, vines and vegetation slithering along the walls, as though the entire bunker had become part of Le Marquage. The thing let out a low, gurgling growl, and Louise's breath hitched. She had to move, had to run, but her feet felt glued to the spot, her legs frozen in place by sheer terror. The air around her grew thicker, more suffocating, as if the bunker itself was closing in, trapping her in this nightmare. Her mind raced, her thoughts a chaotic jumble of disbelief and panic. This couldn't be real. Monsters didn't exist, not outside of myths and ghost stories. But Le Marquage was real, an ancient primal force that had been waiting for her to stumble upon its lair, just as it had waited for those soldiers all those years ago. With a sudden jolt of adrenaline, Louise snapped out of her paralysis. She turned and bolted down the tunnel, her footsteps pounding against the stone floor as she fled back the way she had come. The narrow corridor seemed to stretch endlessly before her, the light from her flashlight flickering as she ran. Behind her, she could hear the creature's wet, slithering movements, its body scraping against the walls as it followed her. The sound was accompanied by the soft, sickening squelch of mud and decayed flesh shifting with each step it took. Louise's lungs burned as she ran, the tunnel narrowing around her, the walls closing in like the jaws of a great beast. Her flashlight beam bounced wildly, illuminating glimpses of rusted metal, broken equipment, and more bones. So many bones. It was as if the entire bunker was a mass grave, a final resting place for those who had been consumed by the creature. She rounded a corner and skidded to a stop. The tunnel ahead was blocked. Thick, gnarled vines crisscrossed the passage, forming an impenetrable barrier. Panic surged through her, and she spun around, her mind scrambling for another way out. But Le Marquage was already there. The creature loomed at the end of the tunnel, its grotesque form shifting in the darkness. Its hollow eyes, voids of pure blackness, seemed to fix on her, and its mouth stretched wider, revealing jagged fragments of bone and moss within. Louise's breath came in short, ragged gasps as she backed up against the wall, her flashlight shaking in her hand. The creature moved closer, its body dragging through the muck, the sound of wet, tearing flesh filling the air. The walls seemed to close in even tighter, the tunnel growing narrower with each passing second, as if the bunker itself was conspiring to trap her. Her mind raced, searching for any way to escape, but there was none. The vines blocked her path ahead, and the creature was closing in from behind. She was trapped, just like the soldiers. The creature stopped just a few feet away, its decayed face twisted into a grotesque mockery of a grin. Louise's heart pounded in her chest as she stared into the gaping holes where its eyes should have been. For a brief, horrifying moment, she felt as though it could see her fear, her desperation, her hopelessness. And then, it spoke. The voice that emerged from the creature's maw was a rasping, wet whisper, like the sound of a body submerged in water for too long. It was a voice that had no business coming from something so grotesque. Yet it filled the tunnel, echoing off the walls and sinking into Louise's bones. "You will not leave!" The words sent a chill down her spine, and Louise felt the world tilt beneath her. She was going to die here. She was going to be just another set of bones in this cursed place, her body claimed by the swamp, her soul trapped forever in the darkness. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, I won't." The creature tilted its head, its mouth widening into a ghastly smile. It took another step forward, and Louise felt the ground beneath her feet grow soft, the stone floor shifting into mud. The walls of the tunnel seemed to pulse and twist, as though the very structure of the bunker was warping around her. She was being consumed, swallowed by the darkness, the mud, and the fear. But then, out of the corner of her eye, Louise saw something. An old rusted pipe jutting from the wall, just within reach. Desperation flared in her chest, and without thinking, she lunged for it, grabbing the pipe and yanking with all her strength. The metal groaned and resisted, but with one final pull, it snapped free. Louise stumbled back, clutching the broken pipe like a weapon, her breath ragged and her heart pounding in her chest. She had no idea if it would be enough to stop the creature, but it was all she had. The creature let out a low growl, its smile fading as it took another step toward her. Louise tightened her grip on the pipe, her knuckles white as she prepared for the inevitable. But then, something unexpected happened. As the creature moved closer, its body passed beneath a crack in the ceiling where water dripped steadily from the surface above. The droplets hit the creature's form, and for a brief moment, the flesh and moss that made up its body seemed to shudder, the water sizzling as it made contact with the decayed material. Louise's eyes widened in realization. Water. The creature was born from the swamp, sustained by the muck and decay, but it couldn't handle pure water. The realization struck her like a bolt of lightning, and a plan formed in her mind. With renewed determination, Louise backed away from the creature, her eyes scanning the tunnel for any source of water. The bunker was old, falling apart in places. There had to be a leak, a pipe, something she could use to flood the area. And then she saw it. Further down the tunnel, an old valve, its metal wheel encrusted with rust. It was connected to a network of pipes that ran along the ceiling, likely part of the bunker's original plumbing system. If she could break the pipe, release the water, maybe, just maybe, she could weaken the creature enough to escape. Without hesitation, Louise bolted for the valve. Part 3. The bunker fights back. Louise's feet pounded against the stone floor as she sprinted toward the rusted valve. Her heart raced with a combination of terror and hope. She didn't know if the plan would work, but it was her only chance. Behind her, Le Marquage moved with a slithering, gurgling persistence, its grotesque form shifting and contorting as it pursued her down the tunnel. The air around her felt thick, oppressive, as though the very atmosphere of the bunker had turned against her. The walls seemed to pulse with life, the narrow corridors closing in on her as though they were tightening, determined to trap her in the darkness. But Louise couldn't stop. Not now. She reached the valve, her hands shaking as she grabbed hold of the rusted wheel. It was corroded, the metal worn and fragile from years of neglect, but she twisted it with all the strength she could muster. The wheel groaned in protest, refusing to move. "Come on," Louise muttered through clenched teeth, her muscles straining as she fought against the valve. "Come on, come on!" Behind her, the creature let out a wet, guttural growl, and Louise could feel its presence drawing nearer. The air grew colder, the walls seeming to close in even more as the swamp dweller advanced, its grotesque, dripping form filling the tunnel with the stench of rot and decay. Finally, with a loud creak, the valve gave way. Louise stumbled back as the wheel spun, and with it came a low, ominous rumble from the pipes overhead. Water began to trickle from the cracks in the ceiling, at first just a few droplets, but then a steady stream. The rusty pipes shuddered as the flow increased, and soon water was pouring from every crack and joint, cascading down the walls in a torrent. Le Maracage let out a sharp, hissing scream as the water splashed against its decayed form. Its body recoiled, the moss and flesh sizzling and steaming as the pure water made contact. The creature's skeletal face twisted into a snarl, and it reached out toward Louise with long, grasping arms. But the water was too much. The creature staggered back, its form breaking apart as the water washed over it. Louise could see the bones within the creature's body splintering and dissolving, the moss and vegetation peeling away in clumps. The water was destroying it, purifying it in a way that the swamp could not resist. For a brief moment, Louise felt a surge of triumph. The creature was weakening, falling apart before her eyes. She had done it. But then, something shifted. The walls of the bunker began to tremble violently, as though the entire structure was groaning in protest. The water pouring from the pipes was relentless, flooding the tunnel with alarming speed. What had begun as a small stream was now a full-blown deluge, and the narrow corridor was rapidly filling with water. Louise's heart sank as she realized what was happening. The bunker was old, too old to handle this kind of pressure. The water wasn't just destroying Le Maracage, it was destroying the bunker itself. The floor beneath her feet buckled, and Louise staggered, grabbing onto the wall to steady herself. Cracks spread through the stone like spiderwebs, and the sound of rushing water filled her ears. She had to get out, now. Turning away from the collapsing tunnel, Louise sprinted toward the entrance. The water was rising quickly, sloshing around her ankles and threatening to sweep her off her feet. The sound of the bunker collapsing behind her was deafening, and she could hear the creature's agonized wails fading into the distance. She rounded a corner, her lungs burning as she pushed herself to keep running. The entrance to the bunker was just ahead, the faint light from outside barely visible through the rapidly flooding tunnel. But as she neared the exit, the ground beneath her gave way. With a cry, Louise fell, her body slamming into the cold, wet stone as the tunnel collapsed around her. Water surged over her, pulling her down into the darkness. She struggled to stay afloat, her arms flailing as the current dragged her deeper into the flooded bunker. Panic seized her chest as the water filled her mouth and nose, choking her. She kicked and thrashed, her lungs burning for air. The water was everywhere, pulling her down, suffocating her, and for a brief moment Louise thought she was going to drown, just like the soldiers who had vanished in this cursed place so many years ago. But then, her hand brushed against something solid, a piece of metal, part of the twisted wreckage of the bunker. Grabbing hold of it, she pulled herself upward, her head breaking the surface of the water just in time to suck in a desperate breath of air. She was still in the bunker, but the water was rising fast, and the walls were collapsing around her. Louise's eyes darted around the flooded corridor, searching for a way out. There, just a few feet ahead, was the entrance, the rusted door she had pried open when she first entered. With the last of her strength, Louise pushed herself forward, fighting against the current as the water threatened to pull her back. The door was just within reach. She could see the light of the forest beyond. With a final, desperate lunge, she grabbed the edge of the door frame and pulled herself through, collapsing onto the muddy ground outside. The water surged out behind her, flooding the area around the bunker's entrance. But Louise didn't stop. She crawled forward, gasping for air as she dragged herself further from the collapsing structure. Finally, when she was far enough from the bunker, she collapsed onto her back, her chest heaving as she stared up at the sky. The roar of the water faded, replaced by the sound of birds chirping in the distance. She had escaped. Part 4. The curse endures. Louise lay on the muddy ground for what felt like an eternity, her body trembling with exhaustion and the aftermath of pure terror. She had escaped the nightmare that had consumed the bunker, but the images of Le Maracage and the soldier's bones haunted her mind, etched permanently into her memory. She closed her eyes, trying to steady her breathing, but the weight of what she had discovered pressed heavily on her chest. After a few moments, she forced herself to sit up, wiping the mud and water from her face. The forest around her was still, peaceful, as though it had no knowledge of the horrors hidden beneath the earth. But Louise knew better. She had seen what lay beneath the surface, the ancient, festering evil that had claimed the lives of so many. She had uncovered the truth, but at what cost? Her mind raced as she thought about what to do next. She couldn't just leave the bunker as it was. Someone would eventually stumble upon it. Another curious explorer, a historian like herself, and they would meet the same fate as the soldiers, or worse. The creature may have been weakened by the water, but she wasn't naive enough to believe that it had been destroyed. No, the curse of the bunker still lingered, and Le Maracage would rise again. But how could she stop it? How could she ensure that no one else would fall victim to the ancient swamp dweller? The bunker had been hidden for decades, sealed away from the world. Yet she had found it, and if she could, others would too. Louise pushed herself to her feet, her legs shaky beneath her. She stared back at the entrance to the bunker, where the water still trickled out, a steady stream that flowed into the underbrush. The air around the entrance felt heavy, oppressive, as though the darkness within still seeped into the world above. Her only option was to seal it, permanently this time. She had to make sure that no one could ever open that door again, that no one would disturb the resting place of Le Maracage and its victims. But sealing the bunker wasn't enough. People had to know, had to understand the danger. She would have to write about what she had seen, about the curse that lay beneath the Maginot Line. She would have to warn others, even if they didn't believe her. With a determined nod, Louise gathered her scattered belongings from the ground. Her camera had been damaged in the flooding, the lens cracked and the body covered in mud, but her notebook was still intact. She pulled it from her bag, flipping through the damp pages filled with notes, sketches, and observations. She would write it all down: the soldier's disappearance, the discovery of the bones, and the encounter with Le Maracage. She would document everything, no matter how unbelievable it sounded. And maybe, just maybe, someone would listen. But as she began to walk away from the bunker, a strange sensation washed over her. A feeling of being watched. Louise stopped in her tracks, her heart skipping a beat as she turned to look back at the entrance. The forest was quiet, the only sound, the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. But there was something else, something she couldn't quite place. And then, she saw it. A figure, just barely visible, standing at the edge of the tree line, half hidden in the shadows. It was tall and thin, its body covered in moss and mud, with hollow, empty eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. Le Maracage. The creature wasn't in the bunker anymore. It was free. Louise's blood turned to ice. She had weakened the creature, but in doing so, she had also unleashed it. The water had flooded the bunker, washing away the only thing that had contained the ancient swamp dweller. And now, it was no longer bound to its underground lair. It was loose in the world above. Panic surged through her, but Louise forced herself to remain calm. She had to think, had to figure out how to stop it. The water had hurt it before, but now that it was free, Would it be vulnerable to the same weakness? Or had it grown stronger, more dangerous? As the creature moved closer, its skeletal face twisted into a grotesque grin. Louise realized that she didn't have time to find out. She turned and ran, her feet pounding against the muddy ground as she fled deeper into the forest. The creature's movements were slow, deliberate, but she could feel its presence growing stronger, its eyes burning into her back as it followed. The curse of the bunker had been released, and there was no escaping it. Epilogue: The Endless Pursuit. Months later, the official report on Louise Fournier's disappearance was brief and unsatisfying. Local authorities had conducted a thorough search of the area around the Maginot Line bunker, but no trace of her had been found. Her colleagues at the Alsace Historical Society described her as dedicated, thorough, and passionate about her research, but no one had heard from her since the day she ventured into the forest to investigate the sealed bunker. The bunker itself remained undisturbed, its entrance once again concealed by the overgrowth of the forest. No one dared to pry open the rusted door, and the stories about the soldiers who vanished inside remained just that, stories. But deep in the heart of the forest, the curse lived on. Le Maracage, the ancient swamp-dwelling creature, roamed freely now, no longer bound to its subterranean lair. It moved silently through the woods, a shadow in the trees, watching and waiting. Those who wandered too close to its territory never returned, their bodies lost to the swamp, their souls claimed by the endless hunger of the creature. And somewhere, far from the Maginot Line, Louise Fournier ran. She had escaped the forest that day, but the curse had followed her. No matter where she went, no matter how far she traveled, she could feel the creature's presence, always just out of sight, always watching. It haunted her dreams, its hollow eyes burning into her mind, its gaping mouth whispering promises of death and decay. Louise knew that she would never be free of the curse. Le Maracage would find her eventually, and when it did, she would join the ranks of the soldiers, her body consumed by the swamp, her bones left to rot beneath the earth. But until that day came, she would keep running, and the curse of the war bunker would endure. The end. Story 3. The Frozen Choir. Location: Old Mill School, Manitoba, Canada. Part 1. The Journey North. Emily Dane watched the snow swirl outside the window of her small rented car as she navigated the narrow, ice-covered roads of rural Manitoba. The sky was a pale, frozen gray, and the horizon stretched endlessly, broken only by the bare silhouettes of trees and the occasional solitary house. The winter had been particularly harsh this year, with temperatures plunging well below freezing, but Emily was used to it. She had grown up in the northern reaches of Canada, and the cold was familiar, almost comforting. But today, the chill in the air felt different, unnatural even. She had been researching tragic accidents for years, fascinated by the strange and often unexplained events that punctuated history. Her latest project had taken her to Manitoba, where a series of accidents and disappearances had occurred over the last century. But there was one story that had gripped her more than any other: the tragedy of Old Mill School ***. The story was well known in local folklore. In the winter of 1942, during one of the coldest winters on record, an entire children's choir had frozen to death inside the school. The cause was officially listed as a combination of a sudden blizzard and a lack of heating, but locals whispered about other, darker explanations. The most chilling of these was the legend of ***, the frost song ***, a wraith-like figure that haunted the school, luring its victims with a haunting melody that could be heard on the wind. The tragedy had become a part of local myth, passed down through generations, but what intrigued Emily the most were the reports of strange occurrences still happening at the old schoolhouse. Despite being abandoned for decades, locals claimed they could still hear the faint echoes of children singing when the wind blew just right. The melodies would drift through the air, accompanied by the eerie sensation of cold seeping into their bones. Emily had come to investigate, hoping to find some truth behind the stories. As a historian and researcher, she was skeptical of the supernatural, but there was something about this story that refused to let her go. She had read every account, visited the local archives, and interviewed as many witnesses as she could. And now, she was on her way to the school itself, determined to find answers. The road wound through a dense forest, the bare branches of the trees scratching at the sky like skeletal fingers. Emily's heart quickened as she spotted the crumbling silhouette of Old Mill School ahead, partially obscured by the falling snow. The building sat alone at the edge of the forest, its stone walls dark and imposing against the white landscape. Pulling the car to a stop at the edge of the property, Emily stepped out into the bitter cold, her breath instantly freezing in the air. The wind howled, carrying with it the faintest hint of a melody, so faint that she wasn't sure if she was imagining it. She pulled her coat tighter around her and made her way toward the schoolhouse. The front door was barely hanging on its hinges, creaking as the wind pushed it back and forth. Emily hesitated for a moment before stepping inside, the wooden floorboards groaning under her weight. The interior was dark, the windows covered in frost, and the air was so cold it felt as though it might freeze her lungs. The old school had been abandoned for nearly 80 years, and time had not been kind to it. The walls were cracked and crumbling, and the ceiling sagged dangerously in places. Despite the decay, Emily could still make out the remnants of the building's former purpose: desks, blackboards, and even old textbooks scattered across the floor. But it was the auditorium that drew her in. The large room at the back of the school had once been the pride of Old Mill School. It was where the choir had performed, where children's voices had echoed through the halls. But now, it was a tomb. As Emily stepped into the auditorium, the temperature dropped sharply, and she had to suppress a shiver. Her flashlight beam flickered over the stage, where the choir had once stood. The room was eerily quiet, the only sound the soft rustle of wind outside. And then, she saw them. The children. Their bodies were still there, frozen in place on the stage, their eyes wide open, staring blankly ahead. They were arranged in neat rows, as though they had never left, their mouths slightly parted as if they were still singing. The frost covered them like a shroud, preserving them in an eternal state of icy death. Emily's stomach churned, and she took an involuntary step back. She had read about the children's deaths, but nothing had prepared her for this. The sight of their frozen, lifeless forms was both tragic and terrifying. They hadn't been removed after all these years, left here to rot in the cold, forgotten by the world. As she stared at the children, a soft sound reached her ears, a faint, delicate melody, like a lullaby carried on the wind. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, and she turned slowly, her flashlight beam sweeping across the dark room. The song grew louder. Emily's heart raced as she realized the sound wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from within the school. Part 2. The Frozen Choir. Emily's hands trembled as she fumbled with her flashlight, the beam shaking as it illuminated the far corners of the auditorium. The haunting melody filled the air, growing stronger with each passing second, its notes cold and otherworldly. She felt the temperature drop even further, the chill biting into her skin despite the layers of clothing she wore. The melody was beautiful, but there was something deeply unsettling about it. It wasn't just a song. It felt like a voice, a presence calling out to her, wrapping itself around her mind and pulling her deeper into the frozen darkness. Instinctively, Emily backed away from the stage, her eyes still fixed on the frozen bodies of the children. Their wide, glassy eyes seemed to follow her as she moved, their frozen mouths still slightly open, as though they were singing along with the melody that filled the air. The song grew louder, and Emily felt a sharp pain in her chest. It was as if the very air around her was turning to ice, freezing her from the inside out. She gasped for breath, her vision blurring as the cold seeped into her bones. The temperature was dropping fast, unnaturally fast. and she knew she had to get out of the school before it was too late. But as she turned to leave, the door at the far end of the auditorium slammed shut with a deafening bang, the sound echoing through the room like the crack of a whip. Part 3. The Choir's Legacy. Emily collapsed against a snow-covered tree, her heart pounding as the cold air filled her lungs. The bitter wind stung her face, but the chill from outside was nothing compared to the unnatural cold that had gripped her in the school. The Frost Song's melody still echoed in her mind, a haunting tune that refused to let go. Her fingers were trembling so badly that she could barely keep her grip on the lighter. She stared at the small flame for a moment, watching it flicker in the wind before finally closing the lighter with a sharp snap. The warmth had saved her, barely, but she wasn't out of danger yet. She turned her gaze back toward the old schoolhouse, its crumbling stone walls barely visible through the falling snow. The place looked harmless from a distance, just another decaying building, abandoned to the elements. But she knew better. Inside those walls, the frost song still lingered, still waited, and the children, their frozen bodies, remained trapped in their eternal state of death. Emily's mind raced as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. The stories she had read about the choir's death had always been shrouded in mystery, but now she understood the truth. The frost song had claimed the children, trapping them in the school and using their souls to fuel its cold, haunting melody. But why? She pushed herself to her feet, her legs trembling beneath her. She couldn't stay here. The creature might be weakened by the warmth of the lighter, but it wasn't gone. And as long as the children's bodies remained in that cursed school, the frost song would never stop. Emily took a deep breath, her mind racing. There had to be a way to free the children, to break the curse that bound them to the school and stop the frost song once and for all. She couldn't leave them like this, frozen in time, trapped in their eternal song of cold and death. But how could she fight something like this? The frost song wasn't just a ghost or a spirit. It was something ancient, something powerful, and it had already claimed so many lives. As she stood in the snow, the wind whipping around her, an idea began to form in her mind. The frost song drew its power from the cold, from the ice and the freezing air that surrounded it. But what if she could break that connection? What if she could find a way to thaw the school, to bring warmth back to the frozen auditorium where the children were trapped? It was a long shot, but it was the only idea she had. She glanced down at her lighter, the small flame flickering in the wind. It wouldn't be enough to melt the entire school, but maybe, just maybe, there was another way. With renewed determination, Emily turned and began making her way back to her car. She had to find something that could generate more heat, something powerful enough to melt the ice that held the children captive. There was a town not far from here, and if she could make it back before the storm worsened, she might be able to gather the supplies she needed. The frost song wouldn't let her go that easily. She knew that much, but she wasn't going to let it win. Part 4. Fire and Ice. Emily drove through the blinding snowstorm with her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The wind howled outside, rattling the car as she navigated the treacherous, icy roads back toward the small town she had passed on her way to the school. Her mind was focused, her thoughts consumed by the plan she had hastily formed. If she could gather enough fuel, enough heat, she could destroy the frost song's power. It would take something drastic, something that could generate enough warmth to melt the ice inside the school and break the creature's hold on the frozen choir. It was risky, and she had no guarantee it would work, but it was the only option she had left. When she finally reached the town, Emily wasted no time. She pulled into a small gas station, the only place still open despite the worsening storm. Inside, the clerk, a middle-aged man with a thick coat and a scruffy beard, raised an eyebrow as she walked in, her face red from the cold. "You're out in this weather?" he asked, his voice thick with the local accent. "You should be careful. This storm's only getting worse." "I know," Emily replied, her voice tight with urgency. "I just need some supplies. Propane tanks, matches, anything that can generate heat." The clerk gave her a puzzled look but didn't ask questions. He nodded toward the back of the store. "We've got propane and some other camping gear. Help yourself." Emily nodded her thanks and hurried to the back, grabbing everything she could find. Several propane canisters, lighters, matches, and anything else that could help her create enough heat to melt the ice inside the school. She had no idea if it would be enough, but she had to try. As she loaded the supplies into her car, the clerk stepped outside, watching her with a curious expression. "You headed somewhere in particular?" he asked, pulling his coat tighter against the wind. Emily hesitated for a moment, then decided there was no point in keeping it a secret. "Old Mill School," she said, I'm trying to break the curse there. The clerk's face paled, and he took a step back. That place is haunted, he muttered, crossing himself. Everyone around here knows to stay away from it. You should too. I can't, Emily said, her voice firm. I've seen what's inside. I can't just leave it like that. The clerk shook his head, his eyes filled with fear. You're risking your life going back there, the Frost Song. It'll take you, just like it took the others. I have to try, Emily replied. She climbed into the car, slamming the door shut before the clerk could say anything else. She didn't have time to explain, didn't have time to convince anyone to help her. This was something she had to do on her own. The drive back to the school was even more perilous than before. The snow had thickened, and the wind whipped across the road in violent gusts, making it nearly impossible to see. But Emily pushed forward, her mind focused on her goal. When she finally arrived back at Old Mill School, the wind had picked up to a howl, and the sky was darkening as night approached. The outline of the school was barely visible through the blizzard, but Emily could still feel its presence, looming over the landscape like a malevolent shadow. She stepped out of the car, clutching the propane canisters to her chest, and trudged through the snow toward the building. The temperature had dropped even further, and the cold bit into her skin like needles. But she didn't slow down. The Frost Song's melody was faint now, almost drowned out by the wind, but she knew it was still there, waiting for her. When she reached the entrance to the school, she hesitated for just a moment, taking a deep breath before stepping inside. The air inside the building was colder than ever, and the frost on the walls had thickened, creeping up from the floor like icy vines. Emily didn't waste any time. She hurried to the auditorium, where the frozen bodies of the children still stood on the stage, their wide, lifeless eyes staring ahead. The Frost Song's presence was stronger here, its melody more pronounced. She could feel it in the air, in the frost that clung to every surface, in the chill that seeped into her bones. But she wasn't afraid. She set the propane canisters in the center of the room, arranging them in a circle. Her hands trembled as she lit the matches, igniting the small torches she had made from scraps of wood. The flames sputtered to life, casting a warm, golden glow over the frozen room. The Frost Song reacted immediately. The melody twisted, becoming discordant, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop even further. The air filled with the sound of cracking ice as the frost on the walls thickened, spreading toward the flames. But Emily didn't stop. She turned up the heat on the propane canisters, watching as the flames grew larger, the warmth spreading throughout the room. The ice began to melt, water dripping from the walls and pooling on the floor. The Frost Song let out a piercing wail, its form flickering in the shadows. The air around Emily grew heavy with tension as the creature materialized once again, its emaciated, ice-covered form emerging from the mist. Its hollow eyes burned with fury as it lunged toward her, its song rising to a deafening crescendo. But the flames kept it at bay. The heat from the propane canisters filled the room, melting the ice and breaking the creature's hold on the frozen choir. The children's bodies, once stiff and lifeless, began to thaw, their frozen forms releasing the souls trapped within. The Frost Song shrieked in agony, its form dissolving as the warmth spread through the room. The song faltered, growing weaker with each passing second, until it was nothing more than a faint whisper. And then, it was gone. The Frost Song had been defeated, its icy grip on the school shattered by the heat of the flames. The children were free. Emily collapsed to the floor, her body trembling with exhaustion. The warmth from the flames washed over her, melting the last remnants of frost from her skin. It was over. Epilogue. A new silence. The storm had passed by the time Emily emerged from Old Mill School, the first light of dawn breaking over the horizon. The air was still cold, but it no longer carried the unnatural chill that had gripped the land before. The Frost Song was gone, its curse broken, and the children's souls had finally been freed from their frozen prison. Emily stood outside the school for a long time, watching the snow fall softly around her. The building was silent now, the haunting melody that had once filled its halls nothing more than a distant memory. The frost that had clung to the walls had melted, leaving behind only the decaying remnants of a forgotten past. She had done it. The curse of Old Mill School had been lifted, and the children were at peace. But even as she turned to leave, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that the school wasn't entirely empty. There was still something there, something lingering in the shadows, waiting. The frost song might have been defeated, but the echoes of its melody remained, faint and distant, like a whisper carried on the wind. As she walked away from the school, Emily knew that she would never forget what she had seen, what she had heard. The frost song's haunting tune would stay with her for the rest of her life, a reminder of the power of the cold, of the horrors that could be hidden beneath the surface of even the most innocent places. And though the school was silent now, she couldn't help but wonder how long that silence would last. The end. Story 4. The Painter's Curse. Location: the Old King's Gallery, Edinburgh, Scotland. Part 1. Arrival at the gallery. Frederick Watts stood outside ****, the Old King's Gallery ****, its grand facade illuminated by the orange glow of Edinburgh's streetlights. The gallery, nestled in a quiet corner of the city, was an imposing structure, its stone walls steeped in centuries of history. It was home to some of the most important and infamous art collections in the world. Tonight, the wind howled through the narrow alleyways, rattling the iron gate that led into the courtyard. Frederick tightened his scarf and took a deep breath. He had been invited here for a job like no other, an opportunity, as the letter had described it, to restore a masterpiece long thought to be untouchable. It was a portrait of Lord Blackwell ***, a nobleman from the 16th century with a dark reputation. The painting had been kept hidden for years due to the strange rumors surrounding it, and now Frederick had been hired to bring it back to life. As he entered the gallery, the curator, ***Mr. Halcroft, ***, greeted him with a nod. Halcroft was a tall, thin man with a gaunt face and an air of quiet authority. His graying hair was slicked back, and he wore a dark tailored suit that seemed perfectly at home in the eerie surroundings. "You've come at the right time, Mr. Watts," Halcroft said, his voice low and measured. "We've cleared the gallery for you. No interruptions." Frederick nodded, feeling the weight of the atmosphere settle over him as he followed Halcroft down the dimly lit corridors. The paintings on the walls seemed to watch him, their painted eyes following his every step. The sound of their footsteps echoed, the gallery's silence almost oppressive. "I've read a bit about the portrait," Frederick said, trying to ease the tension. "Quite the reputation." Halcroft glanced over his shoulder, his face unreadable. "Indeed, Lord Blackwell's portrait is unlike any other. You'll understand soon enough. But be careful, Mr. Watts. The gallery holds more than just art. It has history." Frederick frowned, but said nothing. He had heard whispers of strange happenings at the Old King's Gallery, portraits that seemed to change when no one was looking, figures that moved within the canvases. But he dismissed them as old superstitions, the kind of stories that arose in places with long, dark histories. They reached the restoration room at the end of the hall. The door creaked as Halcroft pushed it open, revealing a high-ceilinged chamber filled with paintings in various stages of restoration. At the center of the room, on an easel draped in cloth, stood the painting that Frederick had come for. "Here it is," Halcroft said, pulling back the cloth with a flourish. "Lord Blackwell." Frederick stepped forward, his breath catching as he took in the portrait. It was larger than he had imagined, nearly life-sized. Lord Blackwell was depicted in rich, dark hues, dressed in fine 16th century attire. His face, pale and gaunt, was framed by long black hair that spilled over his shoulders. His eyes, piercing and cold, seemed to bore into Frederick's soul, even though the painted figure's head was turned slightly away. There was something unsettling about the painting. something that tugged at Frederick's mind, though he couldn't quite place what it was. The colors were muted, the brushstrokes precise, but the figure of Lord Blackwell seemed almost alive. "I'll leave you to your work," Halcroft said, his voice breaking the silence. "But remember, Mr. Watts, this painting is unlike any you've worked on before. Treat it with care." Frederick nodded absently, still staring at the portrait as Halcroft left the room, the door closing with a soft click behind him. He set down his bag and began to unpack his tools. Brushes, solvents, and cleaning cloths were spread out on the table beside him. His fingers were steady, his mind focused, but that sense of unease still lingered at the back of his thoughts. Frederick took a step closer to the painting, examining the layers of grime and dust that had accumulated over the years. The portrait was in remarkable condition for its age, but there were areas where the varnish had yellowed and cracked, distorting the original colors. He dipped his brush into the solvent and gently applied it to a small section of the painting. As he worked, the colors beneath the grime began to emerge, revealing the intricate details of Lord Blackwell's clothing. Frederick's focus sharpened, his movements precise and methodical. Time passed in a blur as Frederick continued his work, losing himself in the delicate process of restoration. The eerie silence of the gallery faded into the background, replaced by the rhythmic strokes of his brush and the soft sound of the solvent dissolving the layers of dirt. But then, something strange happened. As Frederick cleaned a section of the painting near Lord Blackwell's face, he noticed a subtle shift in the figure's expression. At first he thought it was a trick of the light, but as he stared at the portrait, he could have sworn that Lord Blackwell's head had turned ever so slightly, just enough for his eyes to meet Frederick's directly. Frederick froze, his brush hovering in midair. He blinked, convinced he was imagining it. Paintings didn't move, they couldn't. But when he looked again, Lord Blackwell's eyes were still fixed on him. The hairs on the back of Frederick's neck stood on end. He stepped back, his heart racing. He told himself it was just fatigue, that he had been working too long without a break. But the unease that had been lingering at the edges of his mind now surged to the forefront. The gallery suddenly felt much colder. Frederick shook his head and tried to laugh it off. "It's just a painting," he muttered to himself, though his voice sounded hollow in the empty room. But as he turned back to his work, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. Part 2. The Portrait's Power. Frederick's brush hovered above the canvas as he stared into Lord Blackwell's eyes. They seemed more intense now, gleaming with an unnatural awareness, as though the figure in the portrait had become conscious of Frederick's presence. It was an unsettling illusion, but it had to be an illusion. The human mind could play tricks when tired, and Frederick had been working for hours. He shook his head, trying to dispel the strange thoughts. "You're losing it," he whispered, though the sound of his own voice did little to comfort him. He returned to the painting, gently cleaning the dark hues of Blackwell's cloak, but every time his gaze shifted upward, those eyes were there, following his every movement. Frederick wiped sweat from his brow. The room had grown colder, much colder than it had been when he first entered. His breath puffed out in small clouds of mist, and the chill seeped into his bones, making his fingers stiff and uncooperative. He rubbed his hands together, trying to bring warmth back into them, but the cold persisted. "I should take a break," he muttered to himself. The idea of stepping out of the room, even for a few minutes, seemed increasingly appealing. But the restoration was time-sensitive, and he couldn't afford to delay. He forced himself to keep going, even as the growing sense of unease gnawed at his mind. As he continued working on the lower section of the portrait, the sensation of being watched grew stronger. Lord Blackwell's eyes weren't just following him, they were studying him, observing every flicker of emotion on his face, every twitch of his fingers. Frederick's chest tightened with anxiety, and he found it increasingly difficult to focus on the task at hand. Then he heard it. A faint rustling sound, like the brush of fabric against fabric. came from behind him. Frederick froze, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. He turned slowly, half expecting to see someone standing behind him, but the room was empty. The only sound was the faint creak of the gallery settling in the cold night air. But as he turned back to the painting, his heart skipped a beat. Lord Blackwell's head had moved. It was no longer just a slight shift. The figure in the painting had fully turned to face him, his pale, aristocratic features twisted into a cold, unreadable expression. The eyes, once painted with the detachment of a nobleman's portrait, were now alive with a cruel, calculating intelligence. Frederick stumbled backward, knocking over his chair in his haste. His chest heaved with panic, and his mind screamed that this couldn't be real. Paintings didn't move. Figures in portraits didn't turn their heads. And yet, there was Lord Blackwell, his painted form alive with a sinister energy. The gallery's oppressive silence was broken by the faintest whisper, a sound so soft that Frederick wasn't sure he'd heard it at all. He strained his ears, his pulse hammering in his temples. "Help me!" The voice was faint, like the sigh of wind through a crack in the wall. But it was there, and it was coming from the painting. Frederick shook his head violently, trying to clear the fog of terror that had settled over him. "No," he whispered, "this isn't happening." But it was happening. The figure of Lord Blackwell shifted again, his body subtly contorting within the confines of the canvas. His limbs elongated unnaturally, his hands stretching toward the edges of the frame as though testing the boundaries of his prison. His face, once so regal and composed, twisted into a grotesque mask of malice, his features elongating and distorting until they barely resembled a human face at all. Frederick's breath caught in his throat. He had heard of cursed paintings before, stories passed down through the art world of portraits that carried the spirits of the dead, or that trapped their creators within the canvas. But those were just stories. They weren't real, or so he had thought. He stumbled toward the door, desperate to escape the room, but as his hand reached for the handle, it froze in place. The door, which had been closed but unlocked, was now sealed tight, as though something on the other side was holding it shut. Panic surged through Frederick. He slammed his hands against the door, shouting for help, but his voice echoed uselessly in the empty gallery. There was no one else here. He was alone. Behind him, the sound of rustling fabric grew louder. Frederick turned, his heart pounding in his chest. Lord Blackwell's painted form had now fully emerged from the frame. His elongated limbs stretched beyond the borders of the canvas, his grotesque face leering at Frederick with a twisted smile. The figure's movements were slow, deliberate, as though savoring the moment. And then Frederick saw the truth. Lord Blackwell wasn't just a painting. He was a prisoner, trapped within the canvas by some dark, ancient magic. And now, he wanted out. The whispers came again, louder this time, filling the room with a low, insistent chant. "Help me! Set me free!" Frederick backed away, his mind racing. He had to get out of here. He had to find a way to escape before the painting's curse consumed him. But every time he glanced at the door, it seemed further away, the gallery warping around him as though it were alive. And then, something even more horrifying happened. The other paintings, portraits of forgotten nobles, kings, and queens, began to stir. Their painted eyes blinked open, and one by one, their heads turned to watch Frederick with an eerie, silent intensity. They weren't just portraits. They were all trapped, and Lord Blackwell was the one who had imprisoned them. Part 3. Trapped in the Canvas. Frederick's pulse thundered in his ears as the room seemed to close in around him. Every painting in the gallery was watching him now, their eyes gleaming with a hunger that sent chills down his spine. He had to get out, had to escape before Lord Blackwell or one of the other trapped souls reached him. But the door remained sealed, and the air around him felt thick, heavy with an unnatural energy that weighed down his movements. Lord Blackwell's grotesque form continued to stretch beyond the canvas, his limbs elongating like the twisted branches of a tree. His face was barely recognizable as human now. the skin stretched taut over sharp, angular bones. His mouth a gaping maw filled with shadow. His eyes were alive with an otherworldly gleam, fixed squarely on Frederick. "You cannot leave!" the whisper echoed through the room, though Lord Blackwell's painted lips never moved. The voice seemed to come from everywhere at once, crawling through Frederick's mind and coiling around his thoughts. "You are mine now." Frederick stumbled back, his legs shaky, his throat tight with fear. His heart pounded in his chest as he scanned the room, searching for any way to escape. But every time he moved, Lord Blackwell's form shifted with him, blocking his path, cutting off any possible exit. The other portraits remained still, their painted eyes following the scene with silent anticipation. They seemed almost expectant, as if waiting for something to happen, for the final act of this terrible play to unfold. Frederick's breath came in short, ragged gasps. His hands shook as he reached into his bag, fumbling for anything that might help him break free. His fingers closed around the handle of a small palette knife, the tool he had used countless times in his restoration work. It wasn't much, but it was something. Without thinking, Frederick lunged toward the painting of Lord Blackwell, the knife raised in his trembling hand. His mind screamed at him to stop, to run, but desperation overpowered his fear. If he could damage the painting, maybe he could break the curse. Maybe he could sever the connection between Lord Blackwell and the canvas. But as the blade made contact with the painting's surface, something strange happened. Instead of cutting through the canvas, the knife was pulled into it, as though the painting had become a living thing. The blade disappeared into the surface with a soft, wet sound, and Frederick felt a sharp tug on his arm as the canvas seemed to suck him in. He tried to pull away, but the force was too strong. His hand was sinking into the painting, disappearing into the depths of the canvas as though it were made of quicksand. The cold, clammy surface gripped him, pulling him further in with each passing second. Lord Blackwell's eyes gleamed with triumph as his form shifted once more, the elongated limbs twisting and writhing like tendrils of shadow. "You will take my place," the voice whispered, the words wrapping around Frederick like chains. "I have waited so long." Frederick's heart raced as panic set in. He yanked his arm back with all his strength, but the painting held fast, pulling him deeper into its depths. His wrist vanished into the canvas, followed by his forearm. The sensation was cold and wet, like being submerged in icy water, and it sent waves of terror through him. "No!" Frederick shouted, his voice breaking with fear. "Let me go!" But the painting's grip only tightened, pulling him in inch by inch. Lord Blackwell's twisted face loomed closer, his mouth stretching into an unnatural grin. "You cannot escape," the voice whispered. "You belong to me now." Frederick thrashed against the pull of the painting, his free hand scrabbling for something, anything to hold on to. His fingers found the edge of the easel, and he gripped it tightly, his knuckles white with effort. The painting tugged harder, the force almost unbearable, but Frederick held on, refusing to let himself be pulled into the nightmare. His mind raced, searching for a way out. There had to be something, some way to break the curse, to sever Lord Blackwell's hold on the painting. His eyes darted around the room, landing on the other portraits. They were still watching, their expressions unchanged, but there was something in their eyes, something that hadn't been there before. Hope. Frederick's gaze fell on one portrait in particular, a painting of a woman in a long, flowing gown. Her painted eyes met his, and for a brief moment, he felt a connection, a flicker of understanding. She had been trapped too. They all had. But maybe, just maybe, they didn't want him to suffer the same fate. With a surge of adrenaline, Frederick released the easel and reached out toward the woman's portrait. His hand brushed against the cold surface of the canvas, and to his surprise, the painting seemed to respond. The woman's painted figure shifted, her hand reaching toward his as though she were offering him a lifeline. The cold grip of Lord Blackwell's painting loosened, and Frederick felt a rush of warmth flood through him. He grasped the woman's hand. Though it was only paint, it felt real, solid. and pulled with all his strength. There was a sharp ripping sound, like fabric being torn apart, and suddenly, Frederick was free. He stumbled back, his chest heaving with effort. The canvas of Lord Blackwell's painting hung limply from the frame, torn and distorted. The figure of Lord Blackwell had collapsed into the painting, his grotesque form twisting and writhing, as though he were being sucked back into the depths of the canvas. The other portraits remained still, their eyes watching in silence. Frederick staggered to his feet, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know how long the reprieve would last, but he wasn't going to waste it. He bolted for the door, his footsteps echoing through the gallery as he ran. The door, once sealed, now gave way with a loud creak, and Frederick burst into the corridor. The cold air of the gallery rushed over him, but it felt different now, lighter, less oppressive. The weight that had pressed down on him since he first entered the gallery had lifted. He didn't stop running until he was outside, the wind whipping through his hair as he stumbled into the courtyard. The cold night air bit at his skin, but it was a welcome contrast to the stifling, unnatural cold of the gallery. Frederick collapsed onto the stone steps, his chest heaving as he gasped for breath. His mind was a whirlwind of confusion and terror, but one thought stood out above all the others. He had escaped. Part 4. The Price of Freedom. Frederick sat on the stone steps of the old King's Gallery, his breath coming in ragged gasps as the cold wind whipped through the courtyard. His hands trembled, not from the chill in the air, but from the sheer terror that still clung to him like a shadow. He had escaped the cursed gallery, but the weight of what he had experienced pressed heavily on his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that he hadn't truly escaped. The gallery, Lord Blackwell, had let him go, but at what cost? The thought gnawed at him, even as he tried to reassure himself that it was over. The wind howled through the narrow streets of Edinburgh, carrying with it the faint echo of whispered voices. Frederick shivered and pulled his coat tighter around him, though the cold outside seemed almost pleasant compared to the unnatural chill of the gallery. As he stood, preparing to leave the gallery behind for good, a voice called out to him from the shadows. "Mr. Watts." Frederick turned sharply, his heart skipping a beat. Mr. Halcroft, the curator, emerged from the darkness, his gaunt face unreadable in the dim light. He stood at the edge of the courtyard, his eyes fixed on Frederick with an intensity that made his skin crawl. "You've done well," Halcroft said, his voice low and cold. "But the gallery, it always claims what it's owed." Frederick's blood turned to ice. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Halcroft's expression remained unreadable. "Lord Blackwell is not the only one trapped within these walls. The paintings, each of them, is a prison, a cage for the souls they contain. And now, Mr. Watts, you've taken his place." Frederick's heart stopped. He took a step back, shaking his head in disbelief. "No, I escaped. I'm free." Halcroft's lips curled into a thin smile. "Are you?" Frederick's mind raced, the horror of Halcroft's words sinking in. He glanced down at his hands, his breath catching in his throat as he saw the faintest shimmer of paint on his skin. The cold crept up his spine, spreading through his veins like frost. "No," Frederick whispered, his voice trembling. "This can't be happening." But it was. As the weight of the curse settled over him, Frederick realized the terrible truth. He had escaped the gallery, but in doing so, he had sealed his fate. He had become part of it, part of the cursed collection that would haunt the old King's Gallery for eternity. Halcroft's smile faded as he turned away, his voice barely audible over the wind. The gallery always takes its due. Frederick stood frozen in place, his heart pounding in his chest. The gallery's doors loomed behind him, dark and foreboding, and he knew that no matter where he went, no matter how far he ran, he would never truly escape. He was trapped, just like Lord Blackwell. The end. Story 5. The Devil's Orchard. Location, Kielder Forest, Northumberland, UK. Part 1. Into the Forest. The Legends of Asterisk Asterisk. Kielder Forest. Asterisk Asterisk had always fascinated Sarah Grange. As a botanist specializing in rare plants, she spent much of her time researching remote, often mysterious regions where unique flora might thrive. So when she first heard about Asterisk Asterisk, the Devil's Orchard Asterisk Asterisk, hidden deep within the vast expanse of Kielder, she couldn't resist. Locals spoke of the orchard in hushed tones, passing down tales of cursed fruit and a malevolent entity known only as Asterisk Asterisk, the orchard keeper Asterisk Asterisk. The stories were old, woven into the fabric of Northumberland folklore, but Sarah didn't believe in such things. The only thing that interested her was the possibility of discovering rare, unclassified plant species. If the orchard existed, there could be untold botanical treasures waiting for her. It was early autumn when Sarah finally set out to explore the forest. She'd gathered as much information as she could, scouring old maps, poring over ancient texts, and even speaking to some of the older locals who remembered the stories their grandparents had told. But despite the research, finding the orchard was no easy task. It was said to be hidden far from any marked trails, in a part of the forest where few dared to venture. The dense canopy overhead blocked out much of the sky, casting the forest in a perpetual twilight. As she ventured deeper into the woods, the air grew cooler, and the sounds of civilization faded away, replaced by the soft rustling of leaves and the occasional cry of a distant bird. The forest floor was thick with moss and fallen branches, and the trees here seemed older, their trunks twisted and gnarled, as if warped by time. For hours, Sarah walked, her GPS useless in the thick woods. She relied on her instincts and the faint traces of old paths that had long since been reclaimed by nature. The deeper she went, the more she felt a growing sense of isolation. There was something about the forest, something ancient, as though it had been there long before humans had ever set foot in it. Her excitement grew as she neared her destination. She could feel it, an intangible pull that guided her forward, urging her to continue. She had been walking for most of the day when she finally saw it through the trees, a break in the dense undergrowth that opened up into a clearing. At first glance, it seemed almost unremarkable. The ground was uneven, covered in patches of blackened grass and twisted roots. But as Sarah stepped closer, she noticed the trees. They stood in a tight circle at the center of the clearing, their bark dark and almost glossy, as though it had been coated in tar. The branches stretched upward like skeletal fingers, and hanging from them were clusters of fruit. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She had found it. The Devil's Orchard Asterisk Asterisk. The fruit was unlike anything she had ever seen before. Each piece was bulbous and fleshy, pulsating slightly as though it were alive. The skin of the fruit was thin, almost translucent, revealing a strange, dark substance swirling inside. They hung low, heavy and ripe, their scent sickly sweet, filling the air with an overpowering aroma that made her feel lightheaded. For a moment, Sarah was mesmerized. The botanist in her was filled with wonder at the strange life before her, but something deeper, a primal instinct, screamed at her to leave. There was something wrong with this place. The trees, the fruit, the very air around the orchard. It all felt off. As she circled the trees, examining the fruit more closely, she noticed something even more disturbing. The bark of the trees was covered in faint indentations, as if hands had once pressed against the surface, clawing to get out. And the fruits, though they appeared to be organic, pulsed in a way that made Sarah's skin crawl. It was then that she heard it, the sound of something moving behind her. A soft rustling, like the whisper of leaves in the wind, but deeper, heavier. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest, and slowly turned around. Standing at the edge of the orchard was a figure, tall, gaunt, and monstrous. It was unlike anything Sarah had ever seen. Its body was made of twisted wood and vines, its limbs long and spindly, and its face a grotesque mockery of human features. Its eyes glowed with an eerie red light, and its mouth was filled with sharp, thorn-like teeth. The creature's entire form seemed to blend into the surrounding trees, as though it were part of the forest itself. Asterisk, asterisk, the orchard keeper, asterisk, asterisk. The creature's glowing eyes fixed on Sarah, and for a moment, neither of them moved. The air between them was thick with tension, and Sarah could feel the blood draining from her face. She didn't know whether to run or stand her ground. The stories hadn't prepared her for this. Slowly, the creature took a step forward, its wooden body creaking as it moved. The vines that made up its limbs twitched and curled, as though they were alive, and the ground beneath its feet seemed to rot away with each step it took. Sarah's mind raced, her body frozen in place. She had to move, had to do something before the creature reached her. But she was paralyzed, her legs refusing to obey as the creature came closer. Then, without warning, the orchard keeper opened its mouth, and from it came a sound, a low, rumbling growl that vibrated through the air. It was a sound filled with hunger, with malice, and it sent a jolt of terror through Sarah's body. The paralysis broke, and Sarah turned and ran. Part 2. The Keeper's Warning. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she sprinted through the dense forest, the twisted trees of the orchard fading into the distance behind her. The ground was uneven, roots and rocks jutting up from the earth, threatening to trip her at every step. Branches whipped at her face and arms, leaving red welts in their wake. But she didn't care. She had to get away from that thing. Behind her, she could still hear the creature moving, its heavy, deliberate footsteps, the creaking of wood, and the faint, almost whisper-like rustling of vines. The sound never seemed to fade, no matter how fast she ran. The orchard keeper was following her. Her lungs burned with the effort of running, her breath coming in ragged gasps, but she didn't dare slow down. The forest around her seemed to close in, the trees pressing in on all sides, their branches like skeletal hands reaching out to trap her. The once comforting scent of pine and earth had turned sour, filled with the same sickly sweetness that clung to the orchard's fruit. A sharp pain shot through her ankle as she stumbled over a root, nearly falling to the ground. She caught herself, but the momentary pause allowed the creature to draw closer. Sarah could feel its presence, an oppressive weight pressing down on her chest, filling her with a growing sense of dread. She had to think, had to find a way to lose it. But the forest was a labyrinth, and without her GPS, which was long out of range, she had no idea which direction she was headed. All she could do was keep moving and hope that something, anything, would help her escape. As she rounded a cluster of trees, she spotted a narrow gap between two large boulders. Without hesitating, she squeezed through, her body barely fitting as she scrambled over the uneven ground. The jagged rocks scraped against her arms and legs, but she pushed through, emerging on the other side into a dense thicket. For a moment, there was silence. The sound of the orchard keeper's footsteps had stopped. Sarah leaned against one of the rocks, trying to catch her breath. Her entire body trembled, adrenaline still pumping through her veins. She strained her ears, listening for any sign of the creature. But all she could hear was the distant rustling of leaves and the soft sigh of the wind. Had she lost it? She didn't dare move. Her mind raced, replaying the events of the last hour. The orchard, the fruit, the grotesque figure that had chased her through the forest. It all felt surreal, like a twisted nightmare from which she couldn't wake. She had come here to study rare plants, not to confront ancient horrors. But the orchard keeper was real, and it had been watching her, waiting for her. Sarah's thoughts were interrupted by a faint sound, soft at first, but growing louder with each passing second. It was the same creaking, rustling noise she had heard before. The sound of vines slithering through the underbrush, of wood bending and groaning under some unseen weight. The orchard keeper was still there. A wave of terror crashed over her, and Sarah knew she couldn't stay hidden for long. The creature would find her eventually, and when it did, there would be no escape. She had to find a way out of the forest before it caught her, before it did whatever it intended to do. With renewed determination, Sarah pushed herself off the rock and started moving again, keeping low to the ground as she weaved through the thicket. Her legs were weak and her muscles ached, but she couldn't afford to stop. Not now. As she moved deeper into the forest, the trees around her began to change. They were older here, their trunks thicker and their branches more gnarled. Moss covered the ground, damp and spongy underfoot, and the air felt colder, heavier. The sunlight barely penetrated the thick canopy overhead, casting long shadows across the forest floor. But it wasn't just the trees that had changed. There was something else, something in the air, a presence, watching her, following her every move. The orchard keeper wasn't alone. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she realized the truth. The forest itself was alive. The trees, the vines, the very earth beneath her feet. They were all part of something much larger, something ancient and malevolent. The orchard keeper was just one piece of it, a guardian perhaps, but not the true source of the forest's power. And it was drawing her deeper in. Suddenly, Sarah's foot caught on something, and she stumbled forward, landing hard on the ground. Pain shot through her wrist as she braced herself, but the fall had revealed something half buried beneath the moss. It was a stone, a large, flat slab, weathered and cracked with age. Strange symbols were etched into the surface, their lines worn and faded, but still visible. Sarah's heart raced as she traced her fingers over the carvings. They were unlike anything she had ever seen before, ancient, almost primal, as if they had been made by hands long forgotten by time. She had found something important. Before she could examine the stone further, a shadow fell over her. Sarah looked up, her blood turning to ice. The orchard keeper stood at the edge of the clearing, its towering form silhouetted against the darkening sky. Its glowing red eyes were fixed on her, and its vine-covered limbs twitched and writhed, as though they were preparing to strike. Sarah scrambled to her feet, backing away from the stone. Her mind raced, searching for a way out, but there was nowhere to run. The creature was too fast, too close, and now it had her cornered. The orchard keeper took a step forward, the ground beneath its feet rotting away with each movement. Its mouth opened, revealing rows of sharp, thorn-like teeth, and a low, rumbling growl filled the air. But then, something unexpected happened. The stone beneath Sarah's feet began to glow. A soft, pale light emanated from the carvings, illuminating the clearing with an ethereal glow. The symbols on the stone pulsed with energy, and the air around her seemed to vibrate with a strange, otherworldly force. The orchard keeper hesitated, its glowing eyes narrowing as it stared at the stone. For the first time since Sarah had encountered the creature, it seemed unsure, almost afraid. And in that moment, Sarah knew she had found the key to her survival. Part 3. The Orchard's Curse. The pale light from the stone pulsed in time with Sarah's heartbeat, filling the clearing with an eerie glow. The orchard keeper remained still, its red eyes locked on the glowing symbols, its vine-like limbs twitching with uncertainty. For the first time, the creature seemed vulnerable, as though the ancient power within the stone had broken its hold on the forest. Sarah's mind raced. She had no idea what the stone was or why it held such power, but she knew one thing. It was the only thing keeping the creature at bay. She could feel the energy emanating from the carvings, a strange primal force that seemed to hum through the air, filling her with a sense of both dread and awe. But the orchard keeper wasn't retreating. It stood at the edge of the clearing, its massive form looming over her, waiting for something, watching her with those unblinking, glowing eyes. Sarah knew she couldn't stay here forever. The power of the stone was protecting her for now, but she had no idea how long it would last. She had to find a way to escape the forest, to get away from the orchard and its monstrous guardian before the curse claimed her as well. Taking a deep breath, Sarah stepped forward, her eyes never leaving the orchard keeper. The creature didn't move, its gaze still fixed on the stone, but she could feel the tension in the air, the sense that it was waiting for her to make a mistake. Slowly, carefully, she began to circle around the stone, keeping one hand on its surface as she moved. The light from the carvings seemed to follow her, casting long, flickering shadows across the ground. She could feel the power of the stone humming beneath her fingertips, its energy thrumming through her veins. As she edged closer to the tree line, Sarah risked a glance toward the path ahead. If she could just make it out of the clearing, maybe she could find her way back to the main trail. But the forest seemed darker now, more oppressive, as though it were trying to close in around her. The trees loomed like ancient sentinels, their gnarled branches twisted and blackened, their roots snaking across the ground like grasping hands. The orchard keeper took a step forward, its vine-covered limbs stretching toward her. The ground beneath its feet withered and rotted away, the once green moss turning to ash as the creature advanced. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she tightened her grip on the stone, the light from the carvings flaring brighter in response. But the creature didn't stop. It took another step, then another, its glowing red eyes fixed on her with a hunger that made her blood run cold. The stone was weakening, its light flickering like a dying flame, and Sarah knew she didn't have much time. She had to do something, anything, to stop the creature before it reached her. Desperation clawed at her chest as she racked her brain for a solution. The stone had held the orchard keeper at bay, but it wasn't enough. The power that had once protected her was fading, and the creature was closing in. And then it hit her. The fruit. The cursed, pulsating fruit that hung from the blackened trees of the orchard. The stories had said that the fruit was forbidden, that it held the souls of the cursed bound to the trees for eternity. But what if that was the key? What if the fruit could break the curse? It was a risk, an insane, reckless risk, but it was the only option she had left. Without hesitating, Sarah turned and bolted toward the orchard, her heart pounding in her chest. The sound of the orchard keeper's footsteps echoed behind her, the ground rotting beneath its feet as it gave chase. The clearing blurred past her as she sprinted toward the blackened trees, her mind focused on one thing: the fruit. She had to reach it before the creature caught her, had to find a way to stop the curse before it was too late. The orchard loomed ahead, its twisted branches reaching out like skeletal arms. The fruit hung heavy from the trees, their fleshy, pulsating forms glowing faintly in the dim light. Sarah's stomach churned as she approached, the sickly sweet scent filling her nostrils. But she pushed the revulsion aside. She didn't have time to hesitate. She reached up and grabbed one of the fruits, its surface slick and warm beneath her fingers. For a moment, nothing happened. The fruit pulsed gently in her hand, its dark substance swirling beneath the thin, translucent skin. And then, all at once, the ground beneath her feet trembled. A low, rumbling sound filled the air, and the trees around her seemed to shudder as though they were alive. The fruit in her hand began to glow, its pulsing quickening, and the air around her grew thick with a strange, oppressive energy. The orchard keeper let out a deafening roar, its vine-covered limbs thrashing wildly as it advanced. The ground beneath it split open, dark tendrils of rot snaking out from the earth, wrapping around the trees and pulling them into the ground. But Sarah didn't let go. She could feel the power of the fruit coursing through her, filling her with a strange, burning heat that spread through her body like wildfire. The light from the fruit flared brighter, and the ground trembled again, more violently this time. The orchard keeper's red eyes flared with fury as it reached for her, its massive form towering over the orchard. The vines that made up its body writhed and twisted, lashing out in all directions as it tried to close the distance between them. But it was too late. With a final desperate cry, Sarah squeezed the fruit in her hand, the pulsing flesh bursting open in a shower of light and dark liquid. The ground beneath her erupted, and the air was filled with a deafening roar as the orchard was consumed by the power of the curse. The trees cracked and splintered, their blackened trunks crumbling into ash. The fruit on the branches shriveled and died, their pulsing forms collapsing in on themselves. And the orchard keeper, the towering gaunt figure that had chased her through the forest, let out one last, earth-shaking scream before it was torn apart, its body disintegrating into a cloud of ash and rot. Sarah collapsed to the ground, her chest heaving as she gasped for breath. The light from the fruit had faded, and the oppressive energy that had filled the air was gone. The orchard was dead. Part 4. The curse lives on. The forest around Sarah was still. The trees that had once been twisted and blackened were now nothing more than charred stumps, their branches reduced to ash. The ground was scorched, the moss and grass burned away, leaving only the dark, cracked earth behind. The sickly sweet scent of the orchard had dissipated, replaced by the acrid smell of smoke and decay. Sarah lay on the ground, her body trembling with exhaustion. She had done it. She had broken the curse. The orchard keeper was gone, and the orchard, its twisted trees and cursed fruit, had been destroyed. But as she lay there, staring up at the sky, a sense of unease settled over her. The forest was too quiet. Slowly, Sarah pushed herself to her feet, her muscles aching from the effort. She scanned the clearing, her eyes darting from the scorched earth to the charred remains of the trees. The air was thick with smoke, but there was something else, something she couldn't quite place. And then she felt it, a faint, almost imperceptible vibration beneath her feet. Her heart skipped a beat as she realized what it was. The ground was pulsing. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she looked down at the earth beneath her. The same dark, swirling substance that had filled the fruit was seeping up from the cracks in the ground, spreading slowly across the scorched earth like a living thing. The orchard wasn't dead. The curse wasn't broken. Before she could react, the ground split open, and from the depths of the earth, a new tree began to rise. Its bark was black and twisted, its branches gnarled and skeletal, and from its limbs hung the same pulsating fruit that had grown in the orchard before. Sarah stumbled back, her heart racing as the truth sank in. The orchard wasn't a place. It was a curse, a living, breathing curse that couldn't be destroyed so easily. The fruit, the trees, the orchard keeper. It would all grow back, no matter how many times it was cut down. The forest had claimed its victims before, and it would do so again. As Sarah turned to leave, the faint sound of rustling leaves filled the air. She glanced over her shoulder, her breath hitching in her throat. The orchard keeper was gone, but something new was growing in its place, and it was watching her. The end.